people have been exchanging goods and ideas on a global scale for millennia. But in the past few decades, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening up of capital markets, the rise of information technology, and the reduction in trade tariffs, the pace of global connectivity has greatly increased as many countries and people have entered into a single global economy of exchange. Although the initial phases of economic globalization may be behind us today, soaring flows of cross-border data channeled through the internet are taking globalization to new levels. Today, 1 billion people are coming online every 5 years as digital platforms are coordinating ever more spheres of economy and society. The level of globalization fostered by the information revolution is altogether unprecedented in human history, as the speed with which information, transactions, and capital can travel virtually anywhere on the planet enables the sustained coordination of human activity at a new scale and level of complexity. Public institutions have proven effective at delivering sustainable solutions to the management of the global economy on its different levels. The industrial age macro-scale management structure of the nation-state has not transformed to meet the demands of an emerging set of global networks that require a new form of management structure that is today significantly lacking, and this has many systemic detrimental effects. Global institutions built on the framework of the nation-state, like the World Bank, WTO, IMF, and United Nations, although effective in some ways, are ultimately an incomplete solution to global governance, as they are piecemeal, undemocratic, often ineffective, and have not created the desired results. The form of hyperglobalization that expanded around the turn of the millennium was based on neoliberal economic theory. It was marked by a reduction in trade barriers, the development of outsourcing and global supply chains, the privatization of state assets, and the shift of power from national legislation to multinational institutions, the massive expansion of the global financial market, and the formation of the global cities network. But the financial crisis was to bring this massive expansion in economic exchange to a shattering end. The global flow of goods, finance, and services flattened. The well-accepted truths of the free market became reopened for questioning, as multinational organizations like the IMF and World Bank have come to have less influence. Through the financial crisis, the political establishment in developed economies became increasingly delegitimatized, as nationalism began to once again expand. While many speculated about the end of globalization, underneath the ashes, the seeds for the next era of globalization had already been sown, as a revolution in information technology was continuing unabated. The model for globalization was transforming. The globalization of today is no longer driven by increasing exchange of goods, but instead information and services. While political organization remains divided, soaring flows of cross-border data are taking global integration to new levels. As we approach 4 billion people connected to the internet, these huge flows of data and the platforms that orchestrate them have become the new architecture to globalization. The story of globalization as it has unfolded over the past decades has been one of a new set of information technologies, enabling the development of a global economic and financial system that brings humanity into a commonly shared value system mediated by markets. In the past, the linkage between the underlying information technology and the institutional structures that resided on them was not apparent. Globalization was seen to be driven by the institutional structure of the multinational corporation, of trade-free agreements, of financial markets, and the physical connectivity of the global city and global air and shipping networks. But after the financial crisis, this started to change. As the underlying information technology began to mature, there was an inflection point. Everything was starting to shift into the realm of technology and information.
But I think what happened with the financial crisis was this period of globalization began to come to an end. Now, I believe that globalization will continue in the sense that companies will continue to trade across borders wherever they can. But globalization as an ideological project driven by policymakers who constantly want to lower borders, cheered by ideologues and intellectuals who say that globalization will produce a more integrated, more liberal, more peaceful world, that globalization is beginning to dissolve before our eyes.
Close your eyes and bring up into your mind a photograph of globalization. How many of you are looking at a cargo ship with lots of containers on it? Today, I'd like to change that image of globalization in your mind.
I think we're moving back to the attitude of the United States after the First World War rather than after the Second World War. Secondly, globalization depended on the European Union advancing, sucking in more members. That process has reached its limits and is beginning with Brexit to reverse. The European Union is essentially now reached its limits, essentially paralyzed. Globalization has not killed nationalism, it has not killed xenophobia. Quite often, it's unleashed it and made it even worse. And the very people who are making these hubristic arguments have actually engaged in a massive process of self-dealing. They've done exceptionally well out of this process of globalization. At a time when we've seen economic stagnation, the global elite has got richer and richer and richer and made out like bandits. We've seen politicians in the revolving door going from running regulatory bodies operating in Parliament to working for these global companies. We've seen global companies, great, marvelous global companies that claim to be doing good in the world, concealing money from the tax system, engaging in the most extraordinary process of lobbying, rigging the system, hiding their profits. We've seen a global elite preaching the virtues of globalization, but instead acting as sort of crony capitalists, crony globalists.
Future globalization will be about things that we do, not just things that we make. Digital technology is making telemigration possible, and it's coming faster than most believe.
How to balance the economy, to make it work better for a wider degree of people. I don't know how to summarize that in one word, but
Can you one word?
One of the others.
The one word answer.
I would say technology and all the discrepancies that it's creating.
Is technology a force for good or ill?
For good.
Good?
For good.
We all agree it's good?
In 2015, I started noticing people saying, globalization is dead. I saw it in the headlines. It started coming up in conversations with business leaders. And I even read an article on it at the epicenter of globalization, Davos. So why were so many people talking about the death of globalization? They are picking on a radical shift in the geopolitics with the growth of nationalism.
We know that there are 3 or 4 factors that are derailing the contemporary world order. One is clearly the behavior of the United States in the last 2 or 3 years. Although I would say here, Trump was not the instigator, he's the accelerator. The trend was beginning before him.
So technology is enabling companies like Netflix to completely redefine the global customer away from their geographic location and the country boundaries. In fact, some experts have estimated that the total value generated from this cross-border data flow could be as high as $20 trillion by the year 2025, which is more than the total goods that is exported in the world today.
Yeah, and the point is, there are never ever any agreements which last forever and they are right forever. So to ask for a level playing field is not wrong. The US says we want to have a level playing field in certain areas, that's true, but other countries should ask the same. It's not, the agreements are fitting to a certain purpose. Of course, then we started, the emerging countries, should gain more. China is not any longer an emerging country. Should not be treated as an emerging country. That is changing, and therefore we need a discussion about that, how we rebalance certain things, and that's a completely legitimate question to raise. And I'm not saying all the agreements we did 20 years ago, 15 years ago, or whatsoever are always right forever.
And I do think that things have shifted and people recognize that we need to rebalance a bit and understand the livelihoods question that you're talking about, and that we need to have a bit more of a flexible and hybrid approach to allow countries to maintain rural livelihoods while not, unduly discriminating and shutting off their markets. So we need to find a better balance in that regard.
Should we be bringing digital into the conversation about trade more aggressively in a sense? And bringing kind of that we will need a set of, or presumably you will need a set of lowest common denominator perhaps, but sort of common digital rules to make it, and WTO might be a place, I don't know how realistic that is. How would that look even? Yeah.
So there's 72 countries now that have agreed to begin discussing e-commerce in the WTO. We don't know where that's going to head, but it's an important step forward. The trick with e-commerce is that there are a lot of enabling environment issues that are not likely to be something you can have a harmonized global treaty about. They're more about, digital payment systems or digital documentation or logistics, facilitating logistics, a range of things where you really need a public-private dialogue, and you need some best practice frameworks. But probably the WTO will handle the principles part of it, kind of a basic level of trade principles, if you will. Presumably there will be areas of policy that will differ by country because of their different cultural norms or different policy preferences, that you have to allow for that kind of flexibility. But coming to at least that type of a two-tier or maybe more than two-tier arrangement of identifying a common set of different classes of data that can allow the world economy to be interoperable and operate increasingly as digital plays more of a role and data underlies much of the value chain, that activity that's going on, that's essential. And I think that's, as you suggest, it's got to be a high priority for the way we think about globalization and trade policy going forward. So I think the EU and the US can provide leadership, but I suspect it will not only come from those two. And I would look for a larger coalition moving, maybe led by the Japanese, we'll see.
Although it was long apparent technology and market structures were the driving force at the heart of globalization that would profoundly change societies, what exactly the outcome to that change process would look like had not been apparent. Now, a new set of information technologies were about to give us a glimpse into a future that looked very different from the past. This next stage of economic development works to decentralize economic activity and shifts operations to global information-based networks like never before, with truly profound consequences. It creates networks for people to interact, create, or exchange value directly peer-to-peer, bypassing traditional market systems and existing institutional structures in radical ways. This potential has been there since the advent of the Internet, but is now greatly more viable due to this emerging secure and shared computing infrastructure. Because of the secure nature of these information systems, we can create economies and financial system natively on top of them that delivers the same quality of service anywhere on the planet. Information networks are emerging as the new form of globally distributed coordination. Token markets can potentially enable the management of self-sustaining economies in a distributed fashion. without dependence on the centralized institution of the nation or corporation. The world of today by markets and finance. The world of tomorrow will be an empire of networks. But who will rule that empire?
A new 21st century company is emerging. Now, as I come towards the end of my current phase of research on globalization, I'm left with one thought. That as a society, we are becoming more nationalistic and less open, more closed. But as individuals, we are becoming more global in all that we do in our work and our lives. And these two contrasting narratives is shaping the new globalization for all of us. No, the globalization is not dead. It is accelerating, but it is radically different.